I hate being called a futurist. I think it's more important to understand the present because then you can try and influence the future rather than just predict it.
Esther, it's a real pleasure to get to meet you. And thank you for letting us honor you. We're super excited to induct you into our New York City Tech Hall of Fame. I mean, you've been an inspiration as a New Yorker and an entrepreneur. Your name, your presence here has been felt for a long time. I think you consider yourself a New Yorker for being living here for most of your adult life. You've been part of the New York City tech community for really since its inception of when it got kind of officially on the map. You've been part of the New York Angels since, I think, 2000.
And New York Tech Meetup.
Absolutely, New York Tech Meetup as a first investor in Meetup. And
first investor in Ezra.
First investor in Ezra. So when you think about that journey of like where New York Tech started, I mean, tell us what that was like back then.
Oh, it was kind of a small shoot in a very fancy flower garden or something like that. I mean, It was not the major industry.
Definitely.
Whereas out in Silicon Valley, you go into any coffee shop and people are talking about options and, oh my gosh, he's worth 400 million. And here you get on the subway and people are reading real books and they're ballerinas and accountants. And so it was very much a subculture for much longer here.
Yeah.
I like the diversity here.
Yeah.
And I never moved to Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
People often thought I lived there because I wrote about it so much, but I felt like this is where I live. I go to Silicon Valley to go to conferences and quote to work, but this place is much more in touch with the real world. And so I think the tech that grows here is also more in touch with the real world.
When it started, I think right after college, you moved to New York and started as more of a journalist in media.
I started out when I was 8 years old. I wrote the Dyson Gazette on carbon paper, which was like family happenings. I went to Harvard, but I spent most of my time writing for the Harvard Crimson, the newspaper. I mean, in the end, I joined Forbes magazine as a fact checker, and if I could come up with a good enough story, then I could go be a reporter. Started writing about tech companies. After 3 years, I thought, I want to do something where I'm not just telling stories, I want to help people make real financial decisions. I joined this fund, Newcourt Securities, that had already invested $100 million in this startup, and it was now doing a down round at $15 million.
Wow. That
was losing money, had not yet shipped its first package. Its name was Federal Express.
Wow.
And it turned out pretty well.
And can I ask you why, was there a natural kind of inclination to learn more about tech after coming from FedEx? When
I was applying to Forbes, my alternative was Variety, but more people wanted to write about movies than about business, so I got the job at Forbes.
Got it.
But by then, tech was getting really interesting, and it was sort of the natural thing to do.
And so here you're in Oppenheimer, you basically carved out a job for yourself in covering software.
Right. And then finally I joined this guy who had a newsletter and a conference about the emerging personal computer world. After about half a year, it became clear that he had a conflict of interest because he was chairman of both Lotus and Compaq, which were the hot companies of the day.
Of course.
So I bought the newsletter from him, and then for 25 years ran the conference and the newsletter, and that was just, I'd like to call myself a court jester.
Yeah.
You know, you're at court, but you have no official standing, and everybody talks to you and tells you the truth. And you speak truth to power, but you also know how to keep secrets. And I mean, it's really being present at the creation. It was an amazing 25 years. And what I really liked was discovering new stuff, which is, you know, not so much news, but analysis. What is going on? What's really happening?
Yeah.
I hate being called a futurist because I think it's more important to understand the present because then you can try and influence the future rather than just predict it.
Yeah. Yeah, it seemed like there's more of a path of, instead of selling stock as an analyst, but you're trying to seek the truth. I mean, that's the whole point of being intellectually honest.
Explain the truth.
Explain the truth.
Yeah, what is really happening? And somebody once asked me, what's the most interesting technology right now? And I think it's counterfactuals. You know, understanding what is, what could be, what won't be, what might have been.
Yeah, interesting. So you take over this newsletter, you rebrand it Release 1.0.
Right, Rosen Electronics Letter to REL. Yeah. And kudos to Ben Rosen, who founded it.
Amazing.
Yes.
But then you take it kind of another step further, and I mean, it was so read by some of these amazing technology leaders at the time, whether it be Steve Jobs or Bill Gates.
Steve Jobs once got really mad at me because I wrote this somewhat half-hearted review of the Lisa.
Okay.
And he blamed me for trying to pretend I was Ben Rosen and saying nasty things.
Was that the first time you've ever talked to him?
No, I met him one of Ben's conferences.
Okay.
So that would have been like 1979, 80. For some reason that year he held it at the Playboy Resort on Lake Geneva.
Okay.
Regis McKenna, who was this very famous PR guy, invited me to meet him. So we sat at a table in the bar and were served Diet Cokes, I believe, by a Playboy bunny. And I still have the ashtray I stole from that Playboy Resort.
That's amazing. And what was that first meeting like?
He was amazing. He was respected and admired, and he really was an amazingly smart and charming guy, but he was a fierce competitor. Yeah. So a lot of people really didn't like him in some way, even though they recognized his brilliance. Yeah. But he came to my conference quite a few times. He was at PC Forum. He came and spoke most years. Yeah. He had to leave early to go on the Larry King show. A bunch of us all gathered in Ben Rosen's room because he was still there as well. Yeah. And watching him on TV, it was like, yes, Steve, he can talk for us. Of the entire industry, he was clearly the very best person then, and I would say still, to explain us to a broader public. Wow. I mean, he was amazing.
Yeah. And what did you do from a newsletter content perspective and what you did at PC Forum to get the likes of a Steve Jobs and a Bill Gates and all these other kind of leaders to engage and be influenced?
Well, I really did try to understand things and explain them rather than the news of the week. It came out once a month. Yeah. It was usually closer to an essay than, 10 timely news tips. Yep. Second, the conference itself and the newsletter, it was for the industry, it was not for customers. And we brought in interesting people and we did not let them give speeches. We mostly did panels where I would ask tough questions. We just really made it interesting. Yeah. One year we brought in Kay Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, to the Pentagon Papers, all that. Yeah. And then there was the time we had Geraldine Laybourne for Nickelodeon. She talked about, she loved her customers. They were kids, and she was wonderful. Yeah. So the next day I had Barry Diller, and I asked Barry Diller, so Geraldine Laybourne loves her customers. Do you love your customers? And he was like, I never thought of that before. It was just really funny. I liked asking questions that you would go there because you would not get sort of the PR spiel. Yeah.
And how did you go from there to then starting to invest?
So that started, believe it or not, in Russia. Because of my father, who worked with NASA and Russian mathematicians, I learned Russian in high school. And my original career goal was to be the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times. And in 1989, finally ended up going there with a guy called Gary Chapman from Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, and Sherry Turkle, who wrote this book, The Second Self, about children and computers. And we went as ambassadors to the Russian computer industry. Very long story, but I ended up going quite frequently and started a newsletter about the East European computer industry and had a second conference called East-West High-Tech Forum. And this guy I knew who had a small venture fund said, you keep talking about people investing in Eastern Europe. Suppose I give you $1 million, would you invest it for me in these computer companies? And I said, I can't do that, I'm a jerk. How much? And then I realized these people who were talking to me because I was a reporter would also talk to me if I was an investor.
Yeah. What really drove you to make that leap? Was it the always make new mistakes kind of mantra?
It was a bunch of things, and honestly, something good doesn't mean it should last forever. There were a lot of other newsletters by this point. Kudos to Kara Swisher and Stuart Alsop, and a lot of people are now on Substack. It wasn't as necessary anymore.
Yeah.
And also the industry was getting less mission driven, so it was time to make a change.
And if you think about that founder that has to choose where they're going to go to start their company, what makes New York the place that they should go?
You don't have to come to New York. The ideal is you don't have to go anywhere in particular, but why is New York better? Yeah. Because really you can find almost anything in New York. You can test things out. It's not an insulated culture. Yeah. I love riding the subway. I love talking to people in the street. You see the world as a world you're part of. Anything that you would want or wish for that New York had in order to make sure it continues to thrive, or if you can wave a magic wand and say, well, if I can change this to make sure it's a better place for entrepreneurs and tech and founders? Well, I object to the notion that what's good for tech is good for everybody. What's good for everybody ultimately is good for tech. And if you think long term, what New York really needs and what the US really needs is more effective government. And I don't want to get political, but it's clearly a time of disruption. And I think disruption is positive if you take advantage of what's crumbling to fix it effectively. And so my hope personally is to work at a level well below politics to improve everything from child care and maternal care to how we pay our workers. I want to replace the work that AI can do. I want to take the money that gets saved ultimately and spend that helping human beings to be better human beings as teachers, coaches, police, and we keep focusing on, well, what can AI do? There's so much only humans can do.